A two-headed snake should be dead. Not metaphorically, not eventually. It should be functionally incapable of surviving long enough for anyone to film it, post it online, or put it in a zoo. Two nervous systems fighting over one body. Two brains sending contradictory signals to the same set of muscles. Two mouths competing to swallow the same prey item, sometimes literally pulling in opposite directions. By every standard biological prediction, polycephaly in snakes is a death sentence. And yet, documented cases of two-headed snakes surviving for years. One in particular lived past its 20th year in captivity. Keep forcing biologists to ask a genuinely uncomfortable question. Is survival here just luck, or is something else going on? Here is the thing that gets glossed over in most nature coverage. Polycephaly is not one condition. It is a category. The mechanisms that produce a two-headed snake are not identical across every case, and those differences matter enormously when you try to understand why some survive, and others don't make it past their first week. The most common pathway is incomplete fission, the same embryological process that produces identical twins in mammals, except in snakes it stops partway through. The embryo begins to split along its anterior axis and then doesn't complete the division. What you get is a single organism with two distinct heads, two separate spinal columns converging into one shared body, and depending on how far the split progressed, varying degrees of organ duplication further down the torso. The split point determines almost everything about the animal's long-term viability. A split that terminates early behind the neck, leaving two fully separate heads with their own esophagi, tracheas, and at least partial lung structures, gives the animal a fundamentally better survival architecture than a split that's so shallow the two heads share critical airway infrastructure almost immediately below the jaw. So when you see the headline, "Two-headed snake survives 20 years, what you are actually looking at is a case where the embryonic split hit a particular geometric sweet spot, deep enough to give both heads independent swallowing and breathing capacity, shallow enough that the shared cardiovascular and digestive system downstream is relatively intact and functional. That is not a miracle of survival instinct. That is a developmental accident that landed in a viable configuration by spatial chance. But the nervous system problem is real, and it doesn't go away just because the anatomy is workable. Each head in a polycephalic snake has its own brain. Not a shared brain with two outputs, two genuinely separate brains, each processing sensory input independently, each capable of initiating motor commands. In species like corn snakes and ball pythons, where most documented long-term survivors come from, the snake's motor control is already somewhat decentralized compared to mammals. A significant portion of locomotion is governed by spinal pattern generators, neural circuits in the spinal cord that coordinate muscle contraction sequences without requiring constant top-down input from the brain. This means a two-headed snake doesn't face the worst-case scenario of two brains in constant direct conflict over every single muscle fiber. The body below the split often just moves, following whatever locomotor rhythm the spinal pattern generators produce. The conflict is highest at the neck and head region, which is exactly where you see the most dysfunction. The heads pulling against each other, one head trying to turn left, while the other tracks something to the right. Feeding is where this neurological tug-of-war becomes genuinely dangerous. Both heads respond to chemical cues and heat signatures independently. If one head detects prey and begins a strike sequence while the other is oriented differently, the muscular contradiction can cause the snake to injure its own neck tissue. Cases have been documented where one head attacked and attempted to constrict or swallow the other head, apparently registering it as a food source. This is not aggression in any meaningful behavioral sense. It is two independent stimulus-response systems operating in the same body without any cross-communication architecture between them. The left brain does not know what the right brain is doing, because in a standard snake, there is only one brain and this problem literally doesn't exist. Two-headed snakes in captivity that survive long-term almost always do so because keepers intervene to feed each head separately, sometimes using a physical divider between the heads during feeding to prevent one from triggering the other's strike reflex. In the wild, that coordination doesn't happen, which is a major part of why wild polycephalic snakes are almost never found as adults. Now, this is where the biology gets genuinely strange. The assumption most people carry into this topic is that polycephaly is purely a developmental error, a glitch in embryogenesis with no possible adaptive value, selected against universally and immediately by natural selection. And that assumption is almost entirely correct. Almost. Because there is a narrow, specific set of ecological conditions where having two sensory processing heads pointed in different directions provides a real and measurable detection advantage. Two heads scanning independently can cover a wider angular range for chemical sensing. Snakes use their forked tongues to sample airborne molecules and triangulate scent gradients. And two tongues operating simultaneously in different orientations provide a larger sampling field. In prey-dense environments, or in situations where predator detection from multiple directions simultaneously is the primary survival challenge, this dual sensory coverage is not nothing. It doesn't outweigh the locomotion costs, the feeding dysfunction, or the oxygen competition between two sets of lung tissue. But it is real, and it is the reason some researchers have proposed that polycephaly in reptiles recurs across evolutionary time not just as noise, but as something that occasionally gets tested against environment before selection eliminates it. The recurrence rate is the data point that actually demands attention here. Polycephaly has been documented across dozens of snake species: corn snakes, king snakes, rat snakes, ball pythons, cottonmouth, garter snakes, even sea snakes. It has been found in wild populations and captive breeding programs. It appears repeatedly in species with no shared recent ancestry, which rules out a species-specific genetic predisposition as the primary driver. What the pattern actually points to is a shared vulnerability in a developmental pathway that is present across the entire clade. The gene regulatory networks that control anterior body axis patterning during early embryogenesis, specifically the Hox gene expression cascades that define where head ends and body begins, are deeply conserved in squamate reptiles. When those networks are disrupted, the disruption tends to produce similar phenotypes across very different species because the underlying molecular machinery is similar. The trigger for that disruption can be temperature shock during early incubation, chemical exposure, hypoxia at a critical developmental window, or simple stochastic errors in the 1 signaling pathway that guides the embryo through its early cleavage stages. In captive breeding programs, where temperature fluctuations during incubation are common, and eggs are sometimes handled in ways that wouldn't occur naturally, polycephalic animals appear at a significantly higher rate than in wild populations. That is not a coincidence. And this gets to something that almost never gets discussed. When people share videos of two-headed snakes online, the captive population is actively biased. The animals we see are not a representative sample of all polycephalic snakes. They are the ones that hatched in controlled environments, received veterinary intervention, were fed by keepers who understood the neurological conflict problem, and were protected from every predator, parasite, and environmental stressor that would have killed them within days in any wild habitat. The survival of a two-headed snake in a zoo or a private collection tells you almost nothing about the fitness of polycephaly as a trait. It tells you something about the capacity of a particular developmental configuration to persist when every external selection pressure is removed. That is a fundamentally different question, and conflating the two leads to genuinely bad intuitions about how natural selection actually operates on developmental anomalies. The deeper question that polycephaly forces into the open is about developmental canalization, a concept that doesn't get nearly enough airtime outside of evolutionary biology seminars. Canalization is the tendency of a developmental process to produce the same outcome reliably across a wide range of genetic backgrounds and environmental conditions. A highly canalized trait is one where the developmental pathway is buffered against perturbation. You can introduce temperature variation, mild chemical stress, or minor genetic mutations, and the organism still arrives at the same endpoint. A poorly canalized trait is sensitive to perturbation, producing variable outcomes when conditions shift. The anterior body axis in snakes, the region governing head formation, is less canalized than most comparable structures in mammals. Mammalian embryos have extensive error correction mechanisms in their early developmental stages that reptile embryos simply don't have to the same degree, partly because reptile eggs develop externally without the buffering provided by a placental environment. Which means when something goes wrong during the critical window of axis establishment, it goes wrong more visibly, more dramatically, and more often in ways that produce live animals rather than early embryonic failures. So the two-headed snake is not just a curiosity about one weird animal. It is a window into how developmental robustness, or the lack of it, shapes what kinds of variation actually enter the world and get tested by selection. Most developmental errors get cleared before they become visible. The ones that slip through are the ones where the underlying anatomy, despite being wildly different from the standard template, still satisfies the minimum functional requirements for the organism to persist long enough to be observed. Two heads on a snake can satisfy those minimum requirements under specific conditions. Two heads on a mammal almost never can, because mammalian cardiovascular and thermoregulatory demands are so much more complex and tightly integrated that a split body plan almost immediately hits a wall of physiological incompatibility. The reptile body plan, with its lower metabolic rate, ectothermic physiology, and more modular organ architecture, provides more margin, not much more, but enough in some cases to produce a living animal. Here is what I find genuinely unsettling about the long-term survivors. When you look at detailed behavioral studies of polycephalic snakes kept in captivity, and there are a handful of rigorous ones, not just anecdotal keeper reports. A pattern emerges that nobody really has a clean explanation for. The two heads, over time, tend to develop different behavioral profiles. Not different species-typical behaviors, both heads are still snakes, both respond to prey cues, both shelter-seek and thermoregulate. But one head will consistently be bolder, initiating more exploratory movement, responding more quickly to novel stimuli. The other will be more reactive to threat cues, more likely to adopt a defensive posture. This divergence happens even though both heads share the same hormonal environment through the same bloodstream. The same circulating cortisol, the same testosterone or estrogen, the same metabolic state. The behavioral differentiation is not being driven by endocrine differences. It appears to be emerging from genuinely independent experiential histories. Each head accumulates slightly different sensory input over time, and those differences compound into what looks like distinct behavioral tendencies. That is not supposed to be possible in a time frame of months to a few years. Learning and behavioral modification at that speed, producing that degree of divergence from a shared physiological substrate, suggests the two brains are doing something with their independent sensory streams that we don't fully understand yet. I want to push on the evolutionary framing one more time, because there is a popular misconception worth dismantling directly. People often say that polycephaly proves that nature can produce anything, or that evolution is just random mutation without direction. That reading is exactly backwards. What polycephaly actually demonstrates is how ruthlessly directional natural selection is, and how narrow the viable range of body plans actually is for a given ecological role. The two-headed snake that survives in captivity would be dead within days in any environment where it had to hunt, evade predators, and navigate terrain without human assistance. The developmental pathway that produced it is not being preserved by selection. It is being repeatedly generated by the same molecular vulnerabilities in the same developmental window, and then immediately eliminated in every context where elimination is possible. The captive specimens we observe are the evolutionary equivalent of survivors floating on debris after a shipwreck. Their survival doesn't tell you the debris was seaworthy. It tells you the ocean was calm enough, and the rescue came fast enough that the physics of floating temporarily beat the physics of sinking. What genuinely productive scientific value comes from studying these animals? Then, more than you might expect, and it comes from a direction that has nothing to do with polycephaly itself. The developmental biology of how the anterior axis establishes itself, how Hox's gene expression boundaries get set, how the Wen-T pathway gradients form across the early embryo, how those gradients interact with the physical geometry of the egg, and the thermal environment during the first critical days of incubation, is directly relevant to understanding normal development. Polycephalic animals are natural experiments in what happens when those processes are perturbed past a threshold. They show you which aspects of the developmental program are load-bearing, and which have more flexibility than expected. The fact that a snake embryo can split its anterior axis incompletely and still produce a viable, if compromised, organism tells you something important about the modular architecture of that developmental program. It tells you there is no single catastrophic point of failure. The system fails gradually, in ways that are proportional to how far the perturbation has pushed the geometry off template. The neurological independence question is the one that I keep coming back to, because it has implications that extend well beyond snake biology. Each head in a long-lived polycephalic snake is, by any reasonable definition, a separate center of experience. Separate sensory processing, separate motor initiation, separate behavioral learning history. They share a body, a bloodstream, a metabolic fate, but the processing of what it is to exist in that body, the integration of sensory input into behavioral output, happens in two places simultaneously, without communication between them. There is no corpus callosum equivalent connecting the two brains. There is no shared working memory. Whatever one brain learns about the environment, the other brain does not automatically know. That is an arrangement that should be philosophically interesting to anyone who thinks carefully about what individuality actually means in biological systems. We tend to treat the boundary of an organism as the boundary of an individual. A two-headed snake makes that assumption complicated in ways that are difficult to resolve cleanly. For anyone watching this who works in developmental biology, herpetology, or even comparative neuroscience, the two-headed snake is a genuinely underutilized research model. Not because polycephaly is common or tractable to reproduce experimentally, but because the natural variation in split depth, organ duplication extent, and head-to-body neurological connectivity across documented cases gives you a natural gradient of developmental perturbation with measurable phenotypic outcomes. That gradient is data. It has not been fully exploited, partly because the animals are rare, partly because keeper documentation is inconsistent, and partly because the popular framing of these animals as oddities rather than experimental subjects has historically discouraged rigorous study. Most people watching footage of a two-headed snake are watching it as spectacle, which is fair, it is spectacular. But the actual content of what you are looking at is a failed canalization event in a conserved developmental pathway, producing two independent sensory processing systems in a shared body, surviving only because the specific geometry of the split preserved enough functional independence between the heads while keeping enough shared physiology intact to sustain both. The snake doesn't know it's strange. Each head is doing exactly what its brain is built to do, tracking scent gradients, responding to thermal cues, initiating motor sequences. The strangeness is entirely a product of context. Put one brain in one body and it's just a snake. Put two brains in one body and suddenly you have a question that biology, neuroscience, and philosophy are all still working on separately, without quite enough collaboration between them. The next time you see one of these animals, the question worth sitting with is not, how is it still alive? That question has a reasonable answer, and we covered it. The question worth sitting with is, when two brains share one body and develop divergent behavioral histories without any communication between them, which one is the snake?